The Taliban government has denied education to 1.4 million girls in Afghanistan during its tenure of 3 years, according to the United Nations. This figure hovered around 1.1 million last year, meaning that an additional 300,000 girls have been banned from going to school this year. The denial of education in Afghanistan will have widespread consequences, including poverty, fewer economic opportunities, and the continuation of gender apartheid. Multiple experts and reports from human rights organizations warn that this situation will not only affect young girls and women, but also the future of the entire country. Afghan women's lots have changed dramatically under different rulers in Afghanistan, with significant progress being made in some periods, before regressive governments turned it back. King Amanullah, Zahir Shah, and the communist regime introduced some social reforms benefiting women. On the other hand, the governments of Habibullah, the Mujahideen, and the Taliban reversed many of these. The turn of the 20th century seemed promising for Afghan women. At the time, multiple Afghan women were sent abroad to receive education in the field of medicine by the government. The ruling monarch, Aman-Ullah, established multiple educational institutions for women in the country around 1919. He also outlawed strict dress codes and forced marriages. By 1928, the Afghan government had established even more primary schools for women, but his reforms made Aman-Ullah a target for the conservative factions in the country, who rose up against him, eventually forcing him to abdicate the throne and go into exile in 1929. However, his successor, Zahir Shah, who ruled until 1973, was also a supporter of women's rights. He introduced increasing civil and political rights, including universal suffrage. During Shah's tenure, a leader, Muhammad Dawood, became the prime minister in 1953. Dawood introduced modernization plans for the country, including bills that allowed women to enter the university and work in offices. In 1973, a military coup unseated Zahir Shah, and the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan came into power. At the time, the status quo did not change much for women. But after the Soviet Union's invasion in 1979, many Afghans assumed that Russians intended to corrupt their women, says Dr. Yasmin Jana. This fear precipitated a regression in the status women had. Many of their hard-won rights were curtailed, and Afghan men began to restrict women from going to school or going out. At the time, extreme Islamist ideologies were being used by Afghan, Pakistani, and US politicians to garner support for the war against Russia, and these began to seep into Afghan women's lives. Often, Islam was used as an excuse by local Afghan leaders to justify curtailing women's freedom of movement and education. However, although the circles in which women could operate were being slowly tightened, they still had access to education in schools and the opportunity to work in several areas, such as universities. By the early 1990s, women in Afghanistan were playing a crucial role in contributing to national development. At that time, 70% of school teachers, 50% of government workers, 40% of doctors, and 50% of university students were women. Perhaps the darkest times for women in Afghanistan began after the Taliban took control of Kabul in 1996. After coming into power, the Taliban government started imposing restrictions on women according to their even more rigid interpretation of Islamic law, or Sharia, which many traditional scholars call a misinterpretation. When the Taliban came into power for the first time, they restricted women from receiving basic healthcare or education. Most women were imprisoned in their houses. They closed all women's universities and asked women in the country to quit their jobs. Afghan women were not even free to move about in the once metropolitan capital, Kabul, and were forced to wear burqas imposed by the Taliban government. During the tenure of Hamid Karzai, from 2001 to 2014, Afghan women were isolated due to many of his policies. Karzai supported the Ulema Council's declaration that instructed women to cover their heads with hijab, respect polygamy, and refrain from traveling without a mehram. However, today the former president has urged the Taliban government to allow girls and women to attend schools and universities for the betterment of the country. Karzai stressed the importance of women's education, encouraging all Afghans to play their role in improving the country. After losing control of Kabul in 2001, the Taliban came into power again in August 2021. This time, the situation became even more pathetic. The Taliban barred girls from education beyond the 6th grade, stating that allowing women to go to school after a certain age is against Sharia, or Islamic law. During their 3 years in power, the Taliban have not taken any specific initiatives to reopen schools or universities for girls and women. In 2021, former Higher Education Minister Abdul Haqqani stated that all people in the country would continue their studies in the light of Sharia and that there would be no co-education. Similarly, Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid said that the new government is committed to women's rights, but according to Islamic law. In other words, women's rights are limited to what the Taliban believe is allowed and permitted, and their interpretation is widely criticized as being oppressive. September 2021, the Taliban government reopened schools for boys, and Deputy Education Minister Abdul Hamat stated that girls would not be allowed to go to school until the new education policy was approved. One of the Taliban's ministers even questioned the importance of education, asking why a PhD or master's degree is necessary when all the mullahs and Taliban members are not PhDs, but are still ruling the country. UNESCO warned in its recent report that Afghanistan will face a development crisis in the future due to the lack of university graduates and trained people in the country. UNESCO Director General Audrey Azoulay, in a recent report, appealed to international human rights organizations, activists, and other individuals to put pressure on the Taliban government for the restoration of closed schools in the country.